did the screen stay down?
Coming tonight, Marianne Mavernack, Andrew H. and Janet Dayton Neely, Dean of River Campus Libraries. It is my pleasure to introduce the speaker who will introduce the guest speaker, Annette Weld, who is a dear friend of the library. She's on our library's advisory council and a lover of books and libraries, and I can't think of a better person to introduce our wonderful guest speaker, Annette.
Good evening, everyone. Dear friends and friends I don't yet know, welcome to on this blustery evening to what proves to be an exciting evening. Kristel Thornell was born and educated in Sydney, Australia, and currently lives in Rochester. In 2011, she was named one of the best young Australian novelists by the Sydney Morning Herald. I'd like to introduce Dr. Thornell and Night Street to you in her own words. I came across my first painting by Clara Beckett at the Art Gallery of South Australia, a simple little urban landscape, 2 trams passing on a misty twilight street. Gorgeous, soft, hazy shapes, minimal detail. It had a depth to it that became more hypnotically palpable the longer you stared. This tends to be the case with Beckett's paintings, as if there was something in them behind what was shown, some mysterious emotion, perhaps. It's a lovely quote about Beckett's paintings, but it also describes Thornell's own words in the novel. I've never heard of Clarice Beckett before encountering her fictionalized self in the pages of Night Street. I went quickly to the internet to view these hypnotically palpable works. I'm willing to bet that after tonight, most of you will do the same. We have a double reason to celebrate tonight, thanks to 2 U of R alums, both named Andrew. Andrew Neely, along with his wife Janet, established this Neely series of lectures, now in its 11th season. Andrew Eisman established the Eisman's Writer Award in 2005 to foster bonds between the local literary community and the U of R, and to raise awareness of the River Campus Libraries as a community resource. A sampling of past recipients of the Eisman Award include William Hayen, Seymour Schwartz, and Joanna Scott, who happens to be in the audience this evening. Thank you. Tonight, both Andys can take pride in their gifts to our libraries. It's now my pleasure to welcome Kristel Thornell to the podium and present her with this year's Andrew Eisman Writers Award. With our congratulations, this certificate, and I might add, fake check. It's already been mailed to her. So.
Thank you for that very beautiful introduction. I'm enormously grateful both for the opportunity to be a part of the Neely series and the award. Both are an honor and a delight. And thank you to those of you who came out tonight on such a wintry evening. It was suggested that I speak to you about my experience of bringing my work to the attention of the public and focus on my trajectory as an emerging writer, perhaps offering some of my experiences to the aspiring writers or their friends among you. This is such a potentially broad topic that could, of course, encompass many different things, but I'll try to give you a sense of the meandering path that I've taken with writing and publishing and tell the story of my so-called emerging. In parentheses, I should say that I'm no doubt continuing to emerge. Perhaps one is never finished fully emerging. Myself, I tend to find interesting the parts of the lives of writers and other artists that surround the works they produce but don't often emerge into view, the processes that run parallel to or sit in a ghostly way in the margins of finished works, and I hope that you find these things interesting. When I think about bringing writing to the attention of a public, I'm always struck by how strange and mysterious this very idea is, because of what appears to be a fascinating paradox at the heart of the work of writers, perhaps not of all writers, but likely a good number of them. On the one hand, the intensely private nature of the work, all those hours of at least mental seclusion that some, I'm sure, would probably quite rightly consider excessive, if not downright dysfunctional. Weeks, months, sometimes years during which you sit on your own, doggedly pushing yourself forward somehow, possibly with yourself as your only audience. On the other, the fact that you're making something that you very deliberately intend to share, to let loose into the world, to offer for the scrutiny of a public, and all of the various kinds of exposure that go with publication and having any kind of public identity. So an odd balancing act between deep solitude and an extreme sort of exposure. I wonder sometimes if such a tension isn't part of what's special and powerful about the experience of art in general, both for maker and partaker, that bridging of privacy and sharing, of an inner life and that or those of others. Both my first published novel and the manuscript that I've just finished have as protagonists artists that are in a sense emerging and are having to work to reconcile the privacy of artistic creation with the exposure of public life. The first is a landscape painter, as you've heard, the second a writer. I think that in both novels I was especially intrigued by the personal implications for an artist of coming into view as a public figure, with how desirable and empowering, but also disorienting and frightening that shift can be, and by what in an artist's life lies outside the frame of public visibility. I'll come back to these two novels later in this discussion, but for now I'll speak more explicitly of my own emerging. My story is of a kind that is perhaps getting more and more common in that it involves living in or between several countries, cultures, and languages. I write in English, but I speak Spanish at home. I speak less well, alas, French and Italian, but they're important to me. I was on a panel recently at a literary festival where we were asked to discuss national literature and whether or not in today's globalized society it makes sense to continue even thinking about such a thing. My experience, I think, suggests both that national literature has become a flexible, floating sort of entity, but also that it retains a certain authority. I was born near Sydney, Australia, and I lived in the state of New South Wales until my early 20s and the end of my undergraduate studies. I majored in French and Italian, writing a thesis on the Italian author Giorgio Bassani. Some of you may know his novel, The Garden of the Finzi-Contini, or the film version that was made of that by Vittorio De Sica. I began to live abroad. I spent time in Italy where I taught English, and in Mexico. My husband is Mexican. Later, I went to graduate school studying English and creative writing in New Brunswick, Canada. Later still, we moved here to Rochester so that my husband, who's a physicist, could take up a position here. And we've been based in Rochester for the last 8 years or so, with a lot of time fitted in other places, including a year in Finland recently. So against this rather complicated backdrop, I was trying to make a proper writer of myself. If one large lesson or set of lessons has come out of my experiences, it would be just what a lot of effort and stubborn persistence, and I think flexibility, the trying of different approaches, and no doubt some luck or chance, whatever we want to call it, are required to pull this off. It's a precarious evolution, and I gather from some very established and venerated writers that the writing life can continue to feel pretty precarious, almost all the way through. I can't remember a time when I didn't think that reading and writing was somehow sacred and among the more pleasurable and meaningful ways of trying to understand, trying to make sense of life. I can't remember not wanting to be a writer or writing little bits and pieces, notes, stories, poems, diary entries, fragments of would-be novels. I briefly also wanted to be a detective, but I consider that these two job descriptions somehow overlap. All that obsessive-compulsive interest in people's behaviour and motivations and the significance of moments and chains of events. My MA thesis was on literary detective fiction. I found compelling the idea that you might use some of the conventions of detective fiction to explore disorder and psychological tension without necessarily resolving the mystery ultimately, at least not conclusively, leaving room for uncertainty, a range of possibilities, an enduring mystery. You could also have that lovely hypnotic momentum that really good detective fiction can have. Around that time, I was inspired by works like Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49, Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night, A Traveller, works by authors like Paul Auster, Kazuo Ishiguro, Haruki Murakami, Antonio Tabucchi, works that were pervaded by a sense of enigma and obscure unease. For my master's, I also wrote a novel manuscript set mainly in Mexico that had mystery elements to it but didn't quite keep to the path leading towards clarification that traditional detective fiction tends to follow. It was very postmodern, I'm sure. By the time I finished it in 2000 and something, that sort of creature was already passé. At least it comforted me when I came to make my few attempts at publishing it to think that it might have fared better in the 80s or early 90s, that the times were against me. By that stage, I'd only really attempted to publish the cliché of embarrassing teenaged poems and a couple of short stories with reasonably prestigious magazines, of course. The first submissions shamefully typewriter written with liquid-papered mistakes, all that antique technology, it almost makes me nostalgic. I did get the first significant feedback on my creative work from the industry, as it were, around the time of the Mexican novel. I'd sent a short story to a competition for mentorships through the Australian Society of Authors, and I was selected for one of those, which gave me the opportunity to get some feedback from quite a well-known editor on that manuscript. She apparently liked it. She made a few suggestions. A few email exchanges later, she passed it on to a couple of quite big publishing houses, one of which respectfully declined, and the other declined with a very long silence. I'm afraid that silence as a response is not all that uncommon in the industry. But I was just learning this, and for about a year I waited, hopefully, to hear from the second publisher, checking my email every day. All this left me reasonably dispirited. I tried a couple more publishers with that novel via the slush pile, and a couple of agents in, I must say, a fairly desultory fashion. Next, I wrote a novel set in New York City, what you might call another existential mystery, about an academic whose grip on reality is challenged by discovering that the philosopher she's dedicated her professional life to, famous for preaching relentless optimism, had left behind a collection of extraordinarily depressive diaries. I again made a few pretty risible attempts at publishing this manuscript before deciding that it might be more sensible if I were to put novels aside for a while and knuckle down to trying systematically to publish smaller things. This, I thought, could be the way to progress with more tangible, if small, steps. By that point, I just published some reviews in a Canadian university journal and in Spanish, a brief, bloodless article for an airline magazine on the Australian city of Canberra, which arguably you might think is a rather bloodless city anyway. The editor had made me remove my reference to the poor treatment of Indigenous people, which she found not very upbeat, and it wasn't. She also called it Canberra, an orderly capital, a very catchy title. So I worked on poetry and short fiction for a while, which I'd continued dabbling with, and I sent out packages to publications I didn't have a hope of being considered by. I have a poet friend who says that no rejection letter collection, these days you would have to say rejection email file or something like that, is complete without one from the New Yorker, and I would have to agree. Months passed. I tried other publications into which I thought I might fit a little more plausibly. Journals that sometimes published newer writers. I think that this really can be useful and save you some time, developing a sense of the niches that you might realistically be able to occupy and targeting those, at least until you build up something of a profile. I started to get some timid bites. I'll say as an aside that the notion of a writer bursting from nowhere onto the scene is almost always, I would think, an illusion. There's generally a history, perhaps someone like this one that spans some years, but it may take many, or very many, of misfirings, blind alleys, despair, dubious experiments, short-lived exaltation, despair, more despair, pig-headedness, before that conjuring trick of appearing from nowhere is brought off. If it's any small comfort, the time it takes you to find your tentative, tremulous way into the world of publishing, or one of the many worlds, is probably the time it will take you to coax your craft through several necessary stages of growth, to sharpen your sense of what it might be exactly that you want to explore creatively, to strengthen an instinctual feeling of how to operate, to learn to edit yourself brutally and generously, to doubt each sentence exhaustively and exhaustingly, and to convince yourself that you're besotted enough with the whole daunting rigmarole, and especially with language and what it might be able to do or mean, to make the idea of life without this guiding obsession seem pale, unattractive if not unthinkable. So I got some friendly rejections, then a long and a short listing for a residency program and a Writers' Festival award. Small things, but they were encouraging. Then a poem was taken by an English journal. I think I earned £10 from that, which might have covered a small snack in London had I been able to cash the cheque. Next story went to a new journal that no one had heard of in California that swiftly went under. But finally, a run of stories and poems went to good, solid journals in Australia. Australian editors seemed to respond to my work more readily. I don't know if that confirms the force of national literature. Some of those pieces were clearly set in upstate New York, so was it to do with something more subtle than setting? Australian concerns, some sort of Australian voice. I never really know if such things exist. National identity always seems such a tricky and ambiguous thing. When I'm speaking, I can sometimes hear my own accent wavering in response to what I imagine is a listener's perception of it. I developed a disciplined routine, which I can't recommend enough if you can possibly make the space in your life for it, which is easier said than done, I know. A disciplined routine might be the same as saying an addiction or a compulsion. Most days I went straight to my desk after breakfast, luring myself there with caffeine. I decided that if I were to continue with the writing life or have any shot at it, I'd probably need to A, make more than an occasional £10, and B, be part of a literary community or communities, rather than just floating on the edges of things, trying to establish myself in what felt like a bit of a vacuum. I hadn't necessarily thought I would go back to grad school after the Canadian Masters, but an Australian PhD in creative writing with a scholarship seemed a good way to concentrate on creative work for a few years. That was probably a key decision. Being able to support yourself, however modestly, through writing, and knowing that at least a handful of other people recognise what you're doing as legitimate and not just as a cute hobby or a narcissistical, semi-delusional exercise, is refreshing and significant. It encourages you to believe that you might not be irredeemably ill-suited for the world after all. Different ideas kick around about creative writing programs. They're sometimes viewed as smothering of individuality, factories of a kind of house style, and/or in the case of those with an especially golden bloom of prestige upon them, as offering priceless, borderline corrupt networking opportunities. These things might be true of some programs, they weren't of mine. I began it at the University of Adelaide and finished because my supervisor moved at the University of Western Sydney. What it did give me was a sense of being supported while I focused on putting together a substantial project, and of being connected to other writers with useful insights to offer, possibly more personal than craft-related. My supervisor allowed me a lot of space in which to do what I wanted, trusting me to know where I was going. And the novel I wrote for the creative portion of my thesis and submitted to an Australian prize for an unpublished novel by a writer under 35 was chosen, which entailed it being published. I almost didn't submit the manuscript, which I just finished. I'd done a radical rewrite and I wasn't sure if I was on the right track. I hadn't had time to show it to anyone. And the prize was quite well known for launching the careers of Australian novelists, so I ummed and ahed. I eventually decided to give it a go just before a flight to Helsinki from Toronto. The competition required a money order for a reading fee and that the MS be printed on A4 paper, a format of paper which of course we don't have access to here. So I got the money order made in Toronto from a lovely, sweet trainee employee who took about an hour to produce the thing. The task appeared to disorient him. Arriving disoriented myself in Helsinki after a red-eye flight, I printed the MS on the hotel's printer at eyebrow-raising expense before carrying it through the rain to the post office. The Helsinki Central Post Office is a wonderful building, it's gorgeous 1930s architecture. There I learned that guaranteed delivery by the prize's closing date would cost about €60, which seemed very steep, especially as I was sure that I wouldn't have a chance of winning the competition. And I hadn't lived in Finland yet, so I didn't know that everything's that expensive there. But it's money well spent, because the country runs beautifully. Would certainly be on my short list of places to live. In any case, I thought I could probably trust the Finnish postal service to be efficient, so I gambled on the risky, cheaper option, and sure enough, it arrived. However, the manuscript almost wasn't accepted because the painstakingly produced money order made by the charming trainee bank employee bounced. It was a dud, but I was able to make a late payment and all was well. I'll come back to this novel and read you just a little from it to show you what I'm in a sense talking around. But before I do, let's go to the end of this arc that we've been on. One significant piece of recognition starts a flow. Prizes, I learned, make a crucial difference in lifting a writer out of invisibility into visibility. They can, of course, give you publicity. They get you into newspapers, onto the radio, into the windows of bookstores, and therefore onto the radars of readers. They can attract publishers from other countries to your work. After Australia, my novel was published in Canada and it will appear in Brazil. One prize might encourage the judges of other prizes to consider your work seriously. For me, some other prizes followed the first one. Your platform for applying for grants and such things is strengthened. Here's one proof of the enduring importance of national literature. Being Australian, I was eligible for funding from the Literature Board of the Australia Council for the Arts, even though I was making my life in another country. The beauty of government funding for the arts and of Australian citizenship, I must say. National funding bodies can be hugely important in supporting the work of writers who aren't, let's kindly say, highly commercial. Grants, along with prizes, make the writing life a more viable, or at least a semi-viable option. Being visible is a necessary and a wonderful thing for a writer. A cause for rejoicing if and when you're freakishly lucky enough for it to occur. It can also be challenging for a person who is perhaps more comfortable spending inordinate amounts of time alone than in the public eye. It would be naive to imagine that the arts have ever existed in isolation from market forces. Many artists, writers of the past have worked hard at networking and self-promotion. I think of Dickens going on his endless reading tours or literary salons and such. But there is a feeling among writers now that we are having to work extra hard at self-marketing, and that so-called success means having the kind of public identity that will probably involve having to do a significant amount of self-promotion through public appearances on the internet. For example, you'll probably need to create and maintain a web page and possibly a blog. I don't have a blog on my web page, but I do occasionally accept opportunities to write guest blogs or Q&As for bookshops and literary festivals. All this can take some adjusting to, and it puts an interesting spin on that writerly paradox of the need for both seclusion and attention. All the publicity-related activities take time and can feel like a second parallel job. Furthermore, as you all know, there's an air of nervous uncertainty in the literary world surrounding its own future and even almost its present. We know that bookstores are struggling, as music stores were not so long ago. Publishers are struggling, cutting staff, losing funding. Writers' advances are apparently getting smaller. There are questions about the impact of digital books and Amazon sales, about whether the old agency model, whereby you had an agent representing you to publishers, might not now be outdated, and the future lie in self-publishing, electronic publishing, print on demand, and so on. I've entered writing as a profession, if I can give it such a grandiose title, at this transitional moment where a technological revolution or paradigm shift seems to be afoot. So it's hard for me to evaluate the differences between now and before and where it might all be heading. I haven't had an agent until now. Because publication of my first book came about through a prize, I was advised that I wouldn't need to consider having one until my next project was ready. Some authors I've spoken to reject the idea that you must have an agent, and they would rather keep their 15% commission, thank you very much. But most seem to consider agents important, if not indispensable. Experts whose knowledge of contracts and relationships with publishers and others in the industry can make all the difference and position your work for successful outcomes. Good agents are also often thought to have sharp, experienced eyes and literary instincts. They frequently give editorial input on manuscripts, knowing how to help writers forge products that will correspond to the interests of publishers. I've heard persuasive arguments on both sides, for and against, breathless talk of super agents and dejected talk of agents who don't seem able or willing to achieve much at all for a writer. If you are representing yourself, it's certain that the work of trying to attract the attention of a public and secure the types of support and exposure, reviews and so on that seem to be vital could take considerable time and effort and be a kind of work that you might find uncomfortable. My new manuscript is currently being considered by an agent, so I can only guess at the impact that representation might have. My feeling at this point is that at least for writers of so-called literary fiction interested in working for now with more traditional publishing, having in your corner a well-connected agent who is a genuine champion of your work could be very valuable and help you navigate through the muddiness of publishing. I'm not naturally very at ease with self-promotion or particularly gregarious, though I try to convince myself that it's more fruitful to think of these things not as intrinsic qualities or inadequacies, but rather as skills that can be developed or acquired. One of the more interesting lessons for me as I've been emerging has been the importance of finding a way to be at peace with a public identity, or at least to deal with one in a business-like manner. This can be quite difficult for people who aren't inclined to be socially outgoing or drawn to performance. Such people might normally shirk being at the centre of attention with lights in their faces, even considering such a scenario not unrelated to their worst nightmare. I found it useful preparation for such experiences to work at imaginatively fostering a kind of separation between the more emotionally vocal, inclined to be terrified part of me and a public persona. I don't think this necessarily means fashioning an artificial stage persona. It seems to me quite interestingly to be about channeling the fear into a version of yourself that you can send off onto stages, a little as you might send a character off into a scene that you're writing, a way of simultaneously inhabiting and standing to one side of that character. There are other contexts in which it can feel better to try to see your public identity as somehow distanced from a private you. When it comes to seeing your name in interviews in which you may or may not like how you're represented, or even believe that you said those things with that appalling grammar, seeing yourself photographed and discussed in reviews and blogs. I'm struck by how viscerally even extremely established and celebrated authors often evoke their reactions to hurtful criticism in reviews and interviews, speaking of its traumatic impact. Many profess to not reading reviews, and this seems the product of a hard-earned wisdom steeped in pain. Like enlightenment or perfect non-attachment, you may not ever achieve the ideal, coolly relaxed position in relation to criticism or the various rejections that go with the writing life or to public exposure in general. But any progress you can make in that direction can spare you angst. In general, it seems wise to protect yourself as much as possible from any external judgments that might inhibit your capacity to sit down the next day and try to make something up with fresh words. A final point on the public life of the writer. Networking, creating alliances of different sorts is vitally important, of course, in most professions to varying degrees, and really can help determine and maximize success. In the arts, it appears to be essential. During my first literary festivals, I shyly kept to myself, telling myself that I was too overwhelmed to confront the various parties and drinks gatherings for industry people, and not very in my element with witty banter over cocktails anyway. Then at my third festival, I learnt that frantic, surreally high-level networking goes on these occasions, and if you're not a part of them, you could miss some potentially very important opportunities, such as introductions to agents and publishers. Magic doors don't tend to open. Those agents or publishers would, of course, still have to like your work and think they could sell it in a tough, incredibly competitive market. But you might make some connections that it would be hard to make otherwise, and at least those people will be vaguely aware of you in the future. These parties and receptions can be an odd space to move in, neither entirely social nor entirely professional, but becoming as comfortable as possible there and assertive and confident, even if you have an aversion to blatant self-selling, can be to your advantage. And if you like a glass of wine and you're not a cheap drunk, then this will also be to your advantage. The machinery of this milieu is oiled by alcohol. I once fell out of favour with someone influential by declining her offer to have tequila shots together. So if you don't drink or not the hardest stuff, you have to do your best impersonation of a well-seasoned drinker. I mentioned earlier in this talk that the last two protagonists of my fiction were an artist and a writer. Both were fictional responses, very liberally embroidered with fantasy to historical figures. I didn't plan it that way, but that's how it turned out. The manuscript that I've just completed was inspired by an episode in the life of an historical author whom I won't name for reasons of secrecy and superstition. You may recognise who I'm about to describe, but I won't be able to confirm or deny. In the 20s, when this woman was on the cusp of being properly famous, of emerging as in a powerful way as an author, she went missing for 10 days, or so it was thought, during which she stayed in a hotel in northern England living under a pseudonym. I've imagined into this gap, as it were, in the historical record. What I found so beguiling about the episode was the idea of a woman at a time of personal crisis, in flight from her past life and from her more public identity, even from her own name, in some strange incognito limbo of identity. A woman who seems intent on rewriting her identity, so identity as creative, survival as creativity. For now, this project is called On the Blue Train. My first novel, Night Street, was triggered by a painting, a series of paintings then, that sort of flowered in my head into a fictional artist. So I saw this one in 2007 at the Art Gallery of South Australia. A hazily gentle little painting of a misty city street with two trams passing one another. It somehow belongs to the early 20th century and yet is rather timeless. I read the caption and I'd never heard of this Australian Clara Beckett, who painted this in 1931 and had lived from 1887 to 1935. I found Beckett's work in general, as I got to know it, very evocative. Its atmospheres resonant without being entirely fathomable, which is a seductive combination. Her paintings tend to be resolutely spare, showing straightforward stretches of city and suburban road, seaside views, country fields. There is a wonderful restraint to her work and an instinct for the moody merging of gradations of light and shade. Her paintings have a quiet headiness which seems to encourage you to invent fiction surrounding them. They strike me as images of reverie, almost of the creative process itself. Clara Beckett, the historical woman, only really made her way into the margins of art history. Her work, which wasn't in keeping with the contemporary fashion for rather sweeping, heroic, sunny landscapes, received a fairly ungenerous critical reception, although she stayed in a small circle and was prolific through most of the interwar years, giving solo exhibitions annually for most of the 1950s. She died at only 48 after getting caught out in a storm while painting. She went down with double pneumonia after that, and following her death was largely forgotten by history. When she was rediscovered in the 1970s, hundreds of her paintings had been stored in a shed in the country with the sides had been destroyed. Others had been lost in a bushfire. It is now quite disconnected, but there's still little published material available on her and no biography as such, which may have been something that tempted me. Learning the little that I could about Beckett's life, I found it remarkable, adventurous, brave, artistically rich. She used to pull a homemade trolley around the streets and beaches of Melbourne and work en plein air. She lived with her parents and never married, though she did have relationships with men. I was fascinated by the fact that her story, like that episode in the life of my writer protagonist, was located somewhere mysterious at the far edge of public awareness. What interested me wasn't writing fiction that was faithful to biographical fact, but trying to echo the style of the art with fiction, seeing if I could somehow translate or elaborate on its moods and atmospheres. I wanted my novel to look towards Beckett's life with a gaze as soft-focused as the one that she appears to have used in her paintings. I'll close with a very brief reading from Night Street to leave you with a sense of my creative work. Just before I do, I'll show you the North American YouTube trailer for the novel. These trailers are sort of an interesting development in the promotion of novels. I don't know how effective they are exactly. I think there's the hope that they'll go viral and be emailed to thousands of people. You'll see some more of Beckett's paintings here. Thinking about it. There we go. We've turned down the sound. The music gets a bit swelling at a certain point. Rather Hopper-esque, some of these. The man referred to in the section of the novel that I'm going to read to you is my fictional interpretation of a figure that appears in two unusual paintings that Beckett completed around 1927. It's hard to date her work, but approximately then. This is the first one, Resting Place. It's thought that Beckett might have had some sort of secret relationship with this man who lived not far from her family's home. Usually when she painted people, they were very lightly handled, just suggestions, and this is something of an exception among her work for that reason. This male figure is a very strong presence, and that made me curious about him and about the impact that this man might have had on the artist. So I've reinvented him as a character. This is the section of the novel that introduces the doctor. Though they had glimpsed one another by the bay more days than not for some 20 years, Clarisse had waved only once or twice to the man she thought of as the doctor. They knew one another purely by sight, but she felt they were curiously connected as fellow worshippers of the religion of daily walking. She was planning to address him. He had a stately and composed bearing, appearing closed inside the enjoyment of his exercise. She liked to infer that the outdoors was sacred to him. His stride was leisurely or patient, not without ambition, but having nothing to prove. The evening hour was his favourite, and hers. Morning was an instinctual communion with nature, evening was mature introspection, maybe philosophy. She thought he was an evening creature. From rumour filtered through Mum, she had learnt his specialisation, cardiology, and in which street he lived behind which facade, and that he had a quite successful clinic in East Melbourne. His wife, who was ailing, was almost never seen by anybody, but on Sundays he regularly took his two girls on an outing into the city. The girls had recently come out and were much admired, both reputed to be charmingly lovely, though one, Clarisse gathered, tended to be fretful and the other a bit flighty. She imagined the doctor was a doting father to a fault. A good deal of space had always separated them. One evening she eliminated it. "Hello, we're always passing one another, aren't we?" He accepted the greeting as she had thought he might, unstartled. "What is that you push around?" he asked with a certain inevitability. This is my painting studio. You haven't ever seen me working." He paused. "Of course, how couldn't I, the lady landscape painter? The batty bluestocking." How odd that after a long silence there was suddenly this flow of words linking them. "On the contrary, you're thought of as a talent. They say you exhibit." "I've had my moments," she said, a little archly, studying the back of her not very dainty freckled hand. "You're a local legend," he continued, And now in his voice there was something subtly reckless. Their faces did not change. They seemed to have known the conversation would take this turn, becoming private. They say you keep to yourself. Ah, do you call this keeping to myself? He smiled. In the distance, a small dog frisked into view. I've very often seen you painting. You seem so absorbed. I was curious about that. He lifted his walking stick and pointed again at her cart. Yes, well, it holds my kit. I made it myself. Really. A faint amusement, but no surprise. She did and did not want to be the topic of conversation. And you're a doctor who likes to walk. With convivial self-mockery, he said, my constitutionals. She observed that he chose to be enhanced rather than diminished by his years. He had an air of dignity, but he played the part of the conservative elderly doctor. It was a performance he was accustomed to, though able to drop. Now we're friends, maybe you'll show me one of your paintings sometime. She stood ramrod straight. I'll do better than that. I've been wondering if I might paint your portrait. The doctor looked at her quickly, obliquely, then his gaze travelled to some point on the sea. Please assure me, he said in a soft voice, you don't paint from the nude. She had a troublesome, sprightly feeling and laughed flatly to create a smokescreen around it. Not generally, we're not in Montmartre. Indeed we're not, he said, looking at her again. I'm comforted. His head was tilted, his chin a little lifted. Flattered, but I'm not sure I'd be a very good subject. I didn't have a traditional portrait in mind. It'd be done in the open. I'd set you against a landscape. She added, it would be very masculine. You're poking fun at me, which is disrespectful. Haven't you been taught to respect your elders? Yes, but I'm not all that good at obedience. Had she expected this would be so light and fast? The wind off the sea was powerfully perfumed, mild. Do you paint at home too, he asked, or just out here? A little at home, she hesitated, in the kitchen at night. She watched his eyes stealthily. He was paying attention, she thought. I've envied other artists, men really, their studios, but I've had this, haven't I? So much talk, and it felt unnaturally honest. If I were reincarnated and had to choose between this and a different artist's life, I'd probably wind up with my exact same fate again, she chuckled. I'd be back here over and over, pushing this silly old beast around. Old beast, he repeated, appearing to like this. Do you believe in reincarnation, then? I'm coming to think I believe in most things. The doctor's eyes were direct and speculative. Clarice realised that they had not introduced themselves, as if they were already too familiar with one another to bother. They took the steps, half solemnly, that this dance required. And while they waited for him to agree to entrust himself to her brush, the night laid itself slowly out for inspection. Because it was so difficult, Clarice painted the doctor twice, the second painting following the first with hardly a pause, just the time to get him settled in the new position and for her to half-heartedly clean her brushes with a rag. The paintings were a surprise and at the same time confirmed something. He was not at all sedate in paint. A thick-set man in his early 60s, he was distracting, you would have to say ominous. He threw you off balance, seeming more a tenebrous night bird than a human being. Given the choice, you would surely not trust him. He stood in nature in her paintings, but he was unmistakably the star of the show. The colour in the first was lurid by her standards, brash, with slathers of biting yellow-green, and the man leaned against the railing of a small white bridge. He was appraising the viewer, possessively, arrogantly, from under the brim of his hat. A cane hung from his arm. He had something, but not everything, of the grumpy old man. His eyes were a dark band across a face in which just the tip of his nose and his mouth emerged into light, and the darkness deepened as your eye journeyed over his figure. One arm and most of his torso were virtually black, the black continuing down to his thighs where it abruptly stopped, making him appear an amputee, miraculously standing on the memory of legs. For the second painting, she had positioned him at the end of a pathway bordered by trees. The tree's shadow fell across the path, and he too was a shadow, a gloomy form, whose ponderousness was relieved only by the slight blue filigree of ocean discernible through the trees over his shoulder. This glimpse of water gave the impression of serving as some kind of laughable talisman or prayer. She had hoped he would be a complicated subject, and she had sweated as she worked, but Clarice was certain of the extent of the challenge only when she saw him on her panel, remade in light and shade. She shivered, thinking that perhaps you could confide things, dark things, to the man in these paintings without shocking him, or the dark things would not need to be spoken, they would just sit almost calmly between the two of you. "I'm uglier than you expected." He was quick. "No, you're magnificent." He was. She had not tried to pin a character to a board since the early green portraits. To attempt it was always arrogance. At best you got only a sliver of your subject into paint. If you were lucky, however, the sliver turned out to be raw. It came from the quick. And perhaps she had finally come close to luck with the doctor. Too soon to tell. Not quite sure what to make of these new works, she thought she might like to continue painting people, him at least, investigating further. Clarice wanted more of this thrilling cocktail of power and subservience. His shoulders sagged once she was finished, and he turned deferential, hollowed, but she did not think he was unhappy. He would not be persuaded in for a bathe, despite the closeness between them such that forms between model and artist, a mysterious reciprocal knowledge not born of language. From the water she watched him reclining on the sand. It was a day of rare, loose freedom. She savoured her own buoyancy and primitive mistrust of the waves. Here on occasion even strong swimmers had been carried out to the depths. And I'll leave that there for now. I don't know if we have time for questions or if you have any observations that you'd like to share.